A board induction is vital for new board members to exercise their governance role effectively. Hi, my name is Jimmy Walavyechi and you are welcome to Corporate Governance Africa, where we seek to promote good governance through film. In this video, we draw some lessons from the board induction of the board members of the Development Bank of Rwanda, who were appointed in July of 2020. We consider the subject through the eyes of the company secretary and head of legal, Gloria Tengera. The Development Bank of Rwanda is a public company limited by shares. It was incorporated on the 5th of August 1967. The bank prides itself in being the sole provider of long-term finance in Rwanda for over 40 decades. Gloria first tells us about what the board induction is, using a very interesting analogy of a wedding reception.
Think of a board induction as a welcome, in one word. So say you have a wedding, and you have guests coming. We always have to make room for ushers. People we call ushers. These ushers, their job is to welcome the guests, help to seat them, help to situate them, let them know where the restrooms are. Let them know how long they need to wait for something to happen. Just make people comfortable. That's what we see ushers do. So take that principle and now bring it to an entity, an organization. You're having people join your organization, not just anyone, but directors who are supposed to be your boss's bosses. How would you welcome them? How would you make them feel at home? Because even if they're coming in as directors, this environment is still new to them. They don't know much about what's happening. So you have to think of it in that sense. We're welcoming guests, but we need to go beyond just welcoming them and make them feel at home. How you feel at home is now the different things that you do during that induction process.
I asked Gloria what a company secretary needs to do or to consider when preparing for a board induction. Here she shared 3 important points to consider when a COSEC or a company secretary is preparing for a board induction. She spoke about the image of the organization or the ambience, then the initial physical meeting of the directors, and finally she spoke about the documentation.
I look at it maybe in 3 ways. You're probably going to want to think about the ambience. I know this is probably one thing that no one really thinks about, but what sort of feeling do you want them to have as they walk into the gates or walk into the door of the entity? What ambience do you want them to have? That's one thing you have to think about. 2, you then have to think about the physical setting, the physical meeting. What's that going to look like? It's part of the ambience, but this is a bit more structured. Who are they going to meet? Where are they going to sit? What's going to happen when we all meet? And then you also think about documentation, because these are directors, they're not just coming for the ambience part of it or for the face-to-face, but what is that information that you need them to have that is in writing? So your preparation must have these 3 components, at the very least, at the back of your mind.
Gloria shed some more light on the documentation which was shared with the new board members.
So now it comes down to detailing it. Documentation-wise, what do we want them to know? Do we want them to know the history of the entity? Do we want them to know do we want them to know each other? Because remember, some of these directors don't know the other directors. So do you want to share the profiles of their fellow directors? Like in our case, the board that was the previous board, all of them left at the same time. So which means that we didn't have other directors that they were meeting that had to induct them. So we sat back and said, okay, if I were a new director and I wanted to have a point of view about how the board works, and who would I speak to? So what we did in the documentation, we included the profiles of the outgoing board. So that if when they read through this documentation, they're like, they had this sort of person on the board, or I know so and so, I can call them up and ask them to give me a bit of a sense of how the board was working. Then you also want to maybe look at immediate past history of the company, like what information do you need them to know that you think is important for them. Then also maybe you want to also have the exco profiles, because that's what they'll be working with. So these are things that you think about and you put in a documentation. So you can also go ahead and make a very nice pack, have it professionally done so it looks good, it's in line with the corporate image, because these things are also important at the end of the day, and then you share it. So even the policies, you can also include the policies of the entity that you think are important for them to have at the back of their mind. So there's so much you can do on the documentation side.
She also tells us how her team handled the initial physical meeting.
For the physical meet, you could, because it's not enough to just read the documentation, they also want to see the people behind the documentation. So you can organize, let's say, like in our case, we had a lunch. We first started with a lunch in a specific location. Then we went ahead to have a sort of meeting session back at the bank that was led by a tour, because they need to know, the premises. So you want to take them around for them to see, all the corners of the organization until you lead them to the board. So even I remember at that time we had everyone had a role to play. You are the one going to do tour. You're the one going to be taking care of the meeting place. Different things, so that everyone is involved. Then, so what happens in the physical meeting? So there's a whole agenda on that as well. You organize it however you want. But the important thing about the physical meeting is that they get to hear you. They get to hear you speak. They get to hear the CEO speak. And they also get to hear the heads of departments speak, but in a very general way.
Finally, she briefly considers the issue of the ambience and how they went about it as a team.
And then, of course, the ambience is infused in all this. Whether it's on the documentation side or on the physical side, you still have the ambience infused in it. It could be down to how you set the boardroom. It could be down to how people are dressed that day. Maybe if people are used to being just dressed down, that day they'll maybe dress up a little bit. There are these things you can play around with, but all in the sense of saying that we are happy to receive you, you're welcome, and this is what maybe you need to know starting off.
Gloria was careful to emphasize that the objectives of a board induction cannot be made at one physical meeting of the board members.
The first board induction is usually very big, very dramatic, very, glamorous sort of. But from a point of view of a CS, and also from a point of view of my experience, I have understood that induction can't be a one-off event, So in your board induction, you also have to factor in that you might have to phase this induction over time, to factor in for maybe questions that the directors asked you at that function that they wanted to know. You could have left out something that they wanted to know, so you want to fill in that gap. Or over time, you get a sense of maybe there are things that there are certain facets of these directors that you want to help them with, but you think are equally important for them to function. So you have to cater for that as well. It could be through a training. It could be through a one-on-one session, either through the chair of the board, however that may look like. So it's also important to not look at a board induction as a one-off event, but as a process that is well documented, well thought through, and not just done, haphazardly or by accident. Yeah.
And she also highlighted the very important point that the board induction forms part of the board development. Now, board development refers to the measures which a person takes in order to enhance the individual and collective skills and competencies of the board members. The objective of a board development is so that the directors, both individually and collectively, can be at their very best effectiveness in their oversight role over the management of the organization. When the board of directors is effective, the chances of the organization prospering or reaching its goals are very, very high. She emphasizes that it's very important for the company secretary to interact with the board members so that the organization can identify opportunities or maybe even gaps where the organization can assist the board members to improve or to even get better in particular areas so that they are well-rounded in their oversight role.
Okay, so when directors have just come on board, the only thing you know about them is their profiles. Really, there's nothing much that you know about them. But when you get to interact with them over a few board sessions, few meetings outside of boards, you begin to get the sense that maybe there are things that the organization can do more of to help them. So, like for example, you might have somebody who's an extremely good lawyer, but they have never worked in the banking sector. Yeah. So much as they're on the board because they have that lawyer's heart or that legal perspective, they might need a little bit of help on the banking side, on banking operations, on the banking regulations, because this can be also a whole other world. So you can say, okay, fine, maybe to help this specific lawyer, maybe let me help give them training. Could be a crash course, could be, depending on what is required, on the laws, on the banking laws, or even it could be something as simple as saying, this is where all the laws are. Like, for example, in our country, they're all on the website of the central bank. So you tell them, this is where you look if you're looking for something in this area. But also, maybe you can go ahead and say, because they also need to know what they're looking for, that we do have different operations that look like this. So every time maybe you hear something, maybe if you hear somebody talking about NPLs, a banker will understand what an NPL is. But if you're not from the banking sector, you will not know what that means. So you tell them, every time you hear anything that might seem credit related, this is the regulation you look at. So it's that sort of training. It could be a formal training or it could be an informal one.
Gloria also emphasized that the board induction also helps to cultivate good board dynamics or good relations amongst the board members. The reason is that the induction formally introduces new board members to the other board members, and this provides a favorable environment for which they can break the ice and work together going forward on the board. Board dynamics are the working relations between the board members individually and as a group.
So remember that at the induction stage, the chances that the directors don't know each other is also very high. So if they never got an opportunity to get to meet each other, to get to introduce themselves to one another, to have that sort of first point of contact, the opportunity is lost. You have not forced them to be in a setting where they need to talk to each other, and they're meeting for the first time in a board meeting. They might eventually get there, but you have not made it smooth for them to get there.
A board induction is very important for ensuring that the organization is governed by an effective board. A company secretary ought to give careful thought of the board induction process. They should consider setting aside time to carefully plan the induction, and always remember that the board induction forms part of the board's development for the success of the organization.